$52 billion. That was the number flashing across trading screens before midnight. Not because of a crash, not because of war, not because of some mechanical failure 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. It began with something smaller, colder, meaner, a hand on a shoulder, a voice that said quietly but firmly, "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of that seat." And the man in seat 1A did not move. No one inside Apex Air Flight 492 understood it yet, but in less than 1 hour, the decision made in that narrow aisle would erase $52 billion from a company that had existed for nearly 80 years. The spark was a woman named Emily Carter, 32 years old, senior flight attendant, 8 years with the airline, clean record, perfect attendance. Emily believed she understood people the moment she saw them. She believed she knew who belonged in first class and who did not. And right now she was staring down at a man who, in her mind, clearly did not belong. But the story didn't start on the plane. It started 40 minutes earlier. JFK Airport, Terminal 4. Rain pressed against the glass walls like a grey curtain. Runway lights blinked in the distance through mist and fog. Announcements echoed across the terminal, each voice slightly distorted by age and cheap speakers. Inside the first-class lounge, the air smelled of espresso and polished leather. Most passengers were dressed the way people dressed when they wanted the world to recognize their success. Tailored jackets, silk scarves, designer handbags resting beside crystal glasses of Chardonnay. At the far end of the lounge, near the window, sat a man who looked like he had wandered in by mistake. Grey hoodie, black joggers, old sneakers with creases worn deep into the leather. Noise-cancelling headphones covered his ears, large and matte black like the kind studio engineers used. His head leaned back slightly against the chair. Eyes closed, breathing slow. The man's name was Daniel Brooks, 45 years old. To the casual eye, he looked like someone who had missed a few nights of sleep and didn't particularly care what people thought about his clothes. That part was true. Daniel had spent the last 72 hours locked inside a glass conference room in Palo Alto, negotiating one of the largest semiconductor acquisition deals of the year. $3 billion moving across legal documents and encrypted wires. 3 days of boardrooms, lawyers, investors, phones buzzing without pause. He had finished the deal at 6:30 that evening. The text message waiting on his phone was short. Deal funded. Congratulations. Get some rest. Daniel read it once, then slid the phone back into his pocket. Outside the lounge window, a Boeing 777 rolled slowly toward the runway lights. Flight 492, New York to London. Seat 1A. $14,000. He bought that seat for one reason only. Silence. 6 hours of sleep before a 9 a.m. meeting in Canary Wharf that would decide the future of another company. Daniel exhaled slowly. The lounge hummed with quiet wealth around him. Across the room, 2 hedge fund managers argued softly about bond yields. A woman in a cream-colored coat scrolled through her phone while a waiter refilled her champagne. No one looked twice at the man in the hoodie. That was the way Daniel preferred it. Power moved better when no one noticed it. At 8:10 in the evening, The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Now boarding Apex Air Flight 492 to London Heathrow. Daniel opened his eyes. Calm, focused, quiet. He stood, picked up a worn leather duffel bag, and walked toward the gate. The rain outside had intensified. Water streaked down the windows in crooked lines as the jet bridge door opened. Inside the aircraft cabin, soft blue lighting glowed along the ceiling panels. First class smelled faintly of citrus wipes and fresh coffee. A tall woman stood near the entrance greeting passengers. Emily Carter. Her smile was practiced and efficient, the kind learned after years of greeting strangers who believed money entitled them to the sky. "Welcome aboard," she said automatically. Daniel handed over his boarding pass without removing his headphones. Emily glanced at it. Seat 1A. Her eyes flicked upward, scanning him quickly. The hoodie, the worn shoes, the bag that looked like it had traveled through too many airports. A faint crease appeared between her eyebrows. But she stepped aside. "Straight ahead, sir." Daniel walked down the aisle without looking at anyone. He placed his duffel bag in the overhead bin and sat down in seat 1A. The leather chair was wide, quiet, private. He reclined slightly, pulled his hood up, and closed his eyes again. The engines outside the plane hummed like distant thunder. For the first time in 3 days, his mind began to drift toward sleep. Then something interrupted it. Tap, a finger on his shoulder. He ignored it. Another tap. Harder. Daniel slid one headphone off his ear. Standing beside him was Emily Carter. Her smile had changed. Still polite, but colder now. "Sir," she said, loud enough that nearby passengers could hear, "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." Daniel blinked slowly. "I showed it at the gate." "Yes," Emily replied. "But there seems to be a discrepancy." Around them, a few passengers had begun to watch. A silver-haired man across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly. Emily held out her hand. Daniel sighed and reached into his pocket. The paper ticket was slightly wrinkled from travel. Emily took it quickly and studied it. Her eyes moved from the name on the ticket back to Daniel's face. Daniel Brooks. She repeated the name silently in her head. In Emily Carter's imagination, a man named Daniel Brooks, sitting in the seat 1A, looked very different. Older. Wealthy. Probably wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. Not this man. Not someone dressed like he had walked in from a subway platform. Emily's voice sharpened. "Sir," she said slowly, "I'm going to need you to gather your things and follow me to the galley." Daniel looked up. Calm, but his eyes had changed. "Why?" The word hung in the air. Emily straightened her posture. "Because," she said, emphasizing each syllable carefully, "this seat appears to be reserved for another passenger." Behind her, farther up the aisle, a young man in a bright designer tracksuit leaned against the wall filming something on his phone. His name was Kyle Stanton, 24 years old, influencer, senator's son, 3 million followers online. Kyle grinned as he watched the scene unfold. The plane cabin had gone quiet. Daniel Brooks stared at Emily Carter for several seconds. Then he said 4 words. "I paid for this seat." Emily's smile disappeared. And somewhere far away, in financial markets that had not yet opened for the night, the first invisible crack in Apex Air Airlines had just begun to form. Emily Carter had heard that sentence 1,000 times before. I paid for this seat. Passengers said it when they were drunk, when they were angry, when they wanted special treatment. Usually it meant nothing. But something about the way Daniel Brooks said it made the air in the cabin feel heavier. Not loud, not aggressive, just flat, certain. Emily folded her arms loosely over her tablet. "Sir, we have a situation with the seating manifest." Her voice carried down the aisle with professional sharpness. "And I'm going to need you to cooperate so we can resolve it quickly." Daniel leaned back in the leather seat. The overhead lights reflected faintly on the dark plastic of his headphones resting around his neck. He did not rush his reply. "Resolve it how?" Emily gestured subtly behind her shoulder. Standing near the front galley was Kyle Stanton. The young man was leaning casually against the partition, holding his phone up like a tiny spotlight aimed at the drama. His blonde hair was perfectly styled. His Gucci tracksuit glowed under the cabin lights. Next to him stood a woman barely paying attention to the scene, scrolling through her phone, clearly used to being near someone who attracted attention. Emily spoke again, a little tighter now. "We have a VIP passenger who requires accommodation in first class. Unfortunately, the cabin is full." Daniel followed her glance toward Kyle. His eyes lingered there for a moment. Recognition flickered across his face. Not admiration. Recognition. The quiet kind that came from reading too many financial news reports about political families and their careless children. Daniel looked back at Emily. "That doesn't sound like my problem." The sentence landed in the aisle like a dropped glass. Across from them, the silver-haired man in seat 1B cleared his throat softly. He had been pretending to read the Financial Times, but now the newspaper hovered halfway down his chest. His name was Arthur Caldwell, 71 years old, retired attorney from Boston. 40 years of courtrooms had trained his ears to notice tone. And the tone in Daniel's voice carried something Arthur recognized immediately. Not arrogance, authority. Emily felt the shift in the cabin, too. She straightened her uniform jacket. "Sir," she said slowly, "this is not a negotiation." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to push the moment away. For 72 hours, he had negotiated billion-dollar contracts with men who could collapse entire industries with a single phone call. And now he was arguing about a chair on an airplane. He opened his eyes again. "I bought seat 1A, he said calmly. $14,000 with an American Express Centurion card. You can verify that on your tablet." Emily tapped the screen quickly. She already had. That part was not the problem. The ticket was real. The payment was real. The name matched. What didn't match was the man in front of her. In her mind, Daniel Brooks did not look like the man in this seat. Her voice cooled further. "Sir, airline protocol allows us to reassign seats if necessary to accommodate priority passengers." Daniel's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Priority." Emily nodded toward Kyle again. Kyle grinned wider when he realized he had become part of the conversation. He lifted his phone slightly higher, narrating softly to the camera. "Yo, guys. This is wild. Some dude's causing drama in first class. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Arthur Caldwell lowered his newspaper completely now. "Young lady," Arthur said gently, leaning toward Emily. "The gentleman appears to have a valid ticket." Emily shot him a polite but dismissive glance. "Sir, please remain seated." Arthur sank back slowly, but his eyes never left Daniel. Emily returned her attention to the man in seat 1A. "This will go much faster if you cooperate." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "And go where?" Emily exhaled through her nose. "Off the plane." The cabin went still. Even Kyle stopped talking for a moment. Daniel stared at her as if the words needed time to travel the distance between them. "You're removing me?" Emily nodded once. "Yes." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the armrests. The motion was slow, deliberate. "Coach is full," Emily added quickly. "We can rebook you tomorrow morning." Daniel let out a quiet breath. The kind of breath a man releases when patience is slipping away piece by piece. "Tomorrow morning," he repeated. "Yes." Emily's smile returned, thin as paper. "You'll receive a voucher for the inconvenience." Daniel looked at Kyle again. Kyle raised his champagne glass mockingly. "Appreciate the upgrade," he called out. A few passengers winced. Arthur Caldwell's jaw tightened. Daniel's gaze returned to Emily. "Let me make sure I understand this." His voice was still calm, but something underneath it had sharpened. "You're asking a paying passenger to leave the aircraft so you can give his seat to a social media influencer." Emily's expression hardened instantly. "Sir, that is not what I said." "It's exactly what you said." Kyle laughed loudly. "Bro, you're not winning this." Emily's patience snapped. "Sir, if you continue to refuse crew instructions, you will be considered a disruptive passenger." The words carried weight. Federal law gave flight crews enormous authority once passengers boarded an aircraft. Daniel knew that. Of course he did. He had read more regulatory documents in his life than Emily Carter could imagine. But he also understood something Emily did not. Power often hid behind the quietest people in the room. Daniel leaned back again, settling into the seat as if preparing for a long flight. "Then we're done talking." Emily blinked. "Excuse me." Daniel pulled his headphones back over his ears. "I'm sleeping." The gesture felt like a door slamming shut. Emily stood frozen for a second, her cheeks flushed. No passenger had dismissed her like that in years, especially not someone dressed like this man. She turned sharply and marched toward the cockpit. Arthur Caldwell leaned slightly toward Daniel. "Young man," Arthur said quietly. Daniel slid one headphone aside again. "Yes." Arthur lowered his voice. "She's getting the captain." Daniel nodded once. "I figured." Arthur studied his face. "They can escalate this quickly." Daniel's expression remained calm. "They already have." Arthur hesitated. "You might consider moving, just to avoid the trouble." Daniel's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Mr. Caldwell," he said gently, reading the name on the man's boarding pass clipped to the seat divider. Arthur blinked. "Yes?" "I appreciate the advice." Daniel settled deeper into the seat. "But I'm not moving." The cockpit door opened 2 minutes later. Captain Michael Turner stepped into the aisle with long, impatient strides. 58 years old, 30,000 flight hours, and absolutely no interest in delays. Emily followed behind him like a shadow, arms crossed, satisfaction burning quietly in her eyes. Turner stopped in front of seat 1A. "Sir." Daniel did not look up. Turner's jaw tightened. "Sir." Daniel slowly removed the headphones again. "Yes?" The captain's voice carried the full authority of command. "My crew informs me you are refusing to comply with their instructions." Daniel met his eyes. "Your crew is trying to remove me from a seat I paid for." Turner folded his arms. "You are delaying my aircraft." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You're the one standing in the aisle." The tension snapped tight like a wire pulled too far. Turner leaned down and, without warning, yanked the headphones off Daniel's head. The entire first-class cabin inhaled at once. Arthur Caldwell muttered under his breath. Kyle Stanton whispered excitedly into his phone. "This is about to get crazy." Daniel turned his head slowly toward the captain. His eyes had changed completely now. Dark. Cold. Focused. The kind of eyes that had stared across boardroom tables at men worth 10 times Captain Turner's salary and made them nervous without saying a word. Daniel spoke quietly. "You have 3 seconds to give those back." And somewhere far beyond the airport, in a world of trading floors and electronic markets that never truly slept, the invisible fuse attached to $52 billion had just been lit. Captain Michael Turner did not give the headphones back. Instead, he held them loosely in one hand like they were evidence in a courtroom. The cabin lights reflected off the silver wings pinned to his uniform chest. He looked down at Daniel Brooks with the tired impatience of a man who had spent 3 decades believing his word ended every argument on an aircraft. "You don't get to give orders on my plane," Turner said. The sentence rolled through the first-class cabin like distant thunder. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He simply watched the captain for a moment, measuring him the way a surgeon measures the edge of a blade before making the first cut. Behind Turner, Emily Carter folded her arms tightly across her chest. Her expression had hardened into something colder than professionalism. She believed the situation had already been decided. The captain was here now. The hierarchy was clear. Passengers were shifting in their seats. A woman in row 2 had quietly lifted her phone. The small red recording light glowed against the dim cabin. Kyle Stanton was practically vibrating with excitement. "Oh, man," he whispered to his phone camera. "This is wild." Daniel spoke slowly. "You removed personal property from a passenger." Turner's eyebrows rose. "Your property will be returned once you exit the aircraft." Daniel blinked once. "Calm. Patient. You still haven't explained why I'm leaving." Emily stepped forward before Turner could respond. Her voice sharpened. "Because we have a priority passenger who requires this seat." Daniel glanced toward Kyle again. Kyle gave a small mock salute with his champagne glass. Daniel turned back to Emily. "And that justifies assault?" The word landed harder than anyone expected. Turner's jaw tightened immediately. "Watch your language." Daniel leaned forward slightly in the seat. His voice remained steady, but there was steel inside it now. You just ripped something off my head without permission. Turner shrugged. You were refusing to comply. Daniel let out a small breath through his nose, the kind of breath that carried exhaustion rather than anger. I'm sitting in a seat I paid $14,000 for. Emily snapped back. You're delaying departure. Arthur Caldwell could no longer stay silent. The elderly attorney leaned across the aisle slightly, his voice calm but firm. Captain, with respect, the gentleman appears to have done nothing except remain seated. Turner turned his head sharply toward Arthur. Sir, remain out of crew business. Arthur held his gaze a moment longer than most passengers would have dared. Years of courtroom battles had taught him something about authority. Sometimes it was real. Sometimes it was theater. He sat back slowly, but his eyes never left the scene. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the armrests. Captain, he said quietly, I'm going to give you a chance to rethink this. Emily almost laughed out loud. Turner looked genuinely amused. Oh, really? Daniel nodded once. Yes. For the first time since the confrontation began, the rhythm of the moment slowed. The cabin felt smaller somehow. Tighter. Daniel continued. You walk back to that cockpit. His voice did not rise. You return my headphones. He held Turner's eyes. And we pretend this conversation never happened. The silence that followed felt like the air before a lightning strike. Kyle Stanton burst out laughing. Did this dude just threaten the captain? Emily's lips curled slightly. Turner chuckled under his breath, a dry, humorless sound. Son, he said, leaning closer, I've been flying airplanes longer than you've been shaving. Daniel did not react. Turner straightened again. Now here's what's actually going to happen. He pointed toward the open cabin door behind them. You're getting off this aircraft. Daniel's voice remained level. No. Emily's patience snapped completely. You don't get to say no. The words cracked through the cabin like a whip. Several passengers flinched. Daniel slowly reached into the pocket of his hoodie. Emily jumped back instantly. He's got something. Her voice jumped an octave. Turner's hand moved instinctively toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. The tension exploded across the aisle. But Daniel simply pulled out his phone. He held it up calmly. I'm checking the time. A few nervous laughs escaped from nearby seats. Emily's face burned red. Turner was no longer amused. Put the phone away. Daniel glanced at the screen. It's 8:15 in the evening. He looked up again. I have a meeting in London tomorrow morning. Emily cut him off. You're not going to London tonight. Daniel unlocked the phone. His thumb scrolled slowly through the contact list. The light from the screen reflected faintly in his eyes. Names passed by. Corporate CEOs, private bankers, government regulators, people who moved entire markets with a sentence. His thumb stopped. Victor Pierce, General Counsel. Daniel did not call yet. He simply hovered there. Turner noticed. Put the phone away or I'll have you removed by security. Daniel looked up again. His voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. Security. Turner pressed the radio button on his shoulder. Ground security to aircraft. Level 3 disturbance in first class. The announcement traveled through the metal shell of the plane like a signal flare. Passengers exchanged uneasy looks. Arthur Caldwell leaned toward Daniel again. They're calling airport police. Daniel nodded. I know. Arthur lowered his voice even further. They won't be gentle. Daniel's expression didn't change. That's fine. Emily shook her head. You did this to yourself. Daniel looked at her. For the first time, there was something close to pity in his eyes. Emily, he said softly, reading her name tag. She stiffened. You should really stop talking. Her laugh was sharp. Or what? Daniel studied her face for a moment. Because you're about to meet the man who owns this airline's debt. Emily rolled her eyes so hard it was almost theatrical. Please. Daniel leaned back into the leather seat again. His thumb still rested on Victor Pierce's name. Heavy footsteps thundered down the jet bridge outside. 3 airport security contractors stepped into the aircraft. Large men. Tactical vests. Bored expressions. One of them cracked his knuckles as he walked forward. Where's the problem? Turner pointed directly at seat 1A. That one. Daniel Brooks looked up at the men approaching him. Then he slowly placed his phone on the armrest beside him. He raised both hands calmly. I'm not resisting. The lead officer grabbed the front of Daniel's hoodie. Up, now! Daniel did not move. If you want me off the plane, he said quietly, you'll have to carry me. Around them, phones were rising into the air like a field of small glass witnesses. At least 20 cameras were recording now. Kyle Stanton grinned into his live stream. Oh man, he whispered. You guys are seeing this live. The officer yanked Daniel forward. Fabric tore. Another guard grabbed Daniel's legs. The aisle erupted into chaos. Someone gasped. Arthur Caldwell stood halfway out of his seat. Careful! The officer ignored him. They pulled harder. Daniel's grip tightened instinctively on the armrests. A knee slammed into his ribs. A sharp crack echoed through the silent cabin. Daniel's breath escaped his lungs in a low grunt. But he still did not fight back. He went limp. Dead weight. The officers dragged him down the aisle. His head bumped against the corner of seat 3C. One sneaker slipped off and rolled into the aisle. Captain Turner adjusted his uniform sleeve calmly. Get him off my aircraft. Behind them, Kyle Stanton laughed so loudly it echoed against the cabin walls. Bye-bye, bro. And far away, in the quiet digital networks where fortunes moved faster than airplanes, the fuse burning toward $52 billion had just reached its halfway point. The jet bridge door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed through the narrow corridor like a final verdict. Daniel Brooks lay face down on the rough grey carpet, his cheek pressed against fibers that smelled faintly of spilled coffee and industrial cleaner. His hands were twisted behind his back, wrists cinched tight with a plastic zip tie that bit into the skin every time he moved. For a few seconds he did not breathe. Not because he couldn't, because the pain had taken the air out of him. The knee that had driven into his ribs inside the aircraft had not been gentle. Something inside his chest had shifted the moment it happened. A sharp crack, a deep, hot pressure now spreading through his side like a slow fire. The lead security officer pushed his boot between Daniel's shoulder blades and leaned his weight down. Stay down. Daniel coughed. The taste of copper filled his mouth. He turned his head slightly and spat a thin line of blood onto the carpet. Above him, the fluorescent lights hummed softly. Behind them, Inside the aircraft, the muffled sounds of passengers settling back into their seats drifted through the sealed door. The machine of the airline was already moving forward again. Schedules, timetables, procedures. Captain Michael Turner had returned to the cockpit. Emily Carter was fastening the cabin door, and somewhere in the first-class cabin, Kyle Stanton was probably still holding his phone up, narrating the entire scene to strangers across the internet. But here in the jet bridge corridor, the air had gone cold and still. The officer shifted his weight. "Search him." Another guard crouched beside Daniel and began patting down the pockets of the hoodie with quick, practiced movements. Phone, wallet, keys. Everything went into a small plastic evidence pouch. Daniel did not resist. He did not speak. His breathing came slowly now, measured, the way a man breathes when he understands that panic will only make pain worse. One of the officers looked down at him with a bored expression. Guy thought he could fight the crew. The other shrugged. First-class types are the worst. Daniel almost smiled at that. First-class types. The irony would have been funny if his ribs didn't feel like broken glass every time his chest expanded. The lead officer grabbed Daniel by the arm and hauled him up roughly. "On your feet!" Daniel stood slowly. For a moment, the world tilted sideways. The corridor lights smeared across his vision. He steadied himself against the wall. The officer noticed the hesitation. "Drunk?" Daniel shook his head once. "No." They marched him down the jet bridge toward the terminal. His wrists were still bound behind him, the plastic digging deeper with every step. Passengers in the gate area turned to stare. Some whispered, some lifted phones. Most simply watched the quiet spectacle of a man being walked through the airport like a criminal. Daniel's gaze lifted briefly toward the large digital departure board mounted high above the terminal floor. Apex Air Flight 492. Status: departed. He watched the word for a moment. Departed. A slow breath escaped him. Big mistake. The holding room at Terminal 4 was 10 feet by 10 feet, and painted the exact shade of beige used in government buildings across the country. A metal bench was bolted to the wall. A scuffed desk sat near the door. Behind it sat Sergeant Ryan Cole, 40 years old, former high school linebacker whose shoulders still carried the memory of that identity, even though the years had softened everything else. Ryan typed slowly into an old keyboard that clacked loudly with every keystroke. He did not look up when the guards pushed Daniel into the room. Another one? Level 3 disturbance on the London flight. Ryan sighed. Great. The guards shoved Daniel down onto the bench. The metal was cold through the thin fabric of the joggers. Name. Daniel leaned forward slightly. His ribs protested immediately. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds, regulating the pain the way surgeons and soldiers learned to do. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Ryan looked up now. I said name. Daniel's voice came out dry. I want my phone call. Ryan laughed. It was not a friendly laugh. This isn't TV, pal. He spun the monitor around slightly and began typing again. You cause trouble on an aircraft. You sit here until the NYPD picks you up. Daniel lifted his head. I'm injured. Ryan shrugged. Report says you fell while resisting. Daniel stared at him. The silence stretched. Ryan continued typing. Name. Daniel said nothing. Ryan leaned back in his chair. You don't give me a name. I book you as John Doe. He cracked his knuckles. And you spend the weekend on Rikers while someone figures it out. Daniel slowly raised his head. The fluorescent lights above them flickered slightly. My name, he said quietly, is Daniel Brooks. Ryan froze for a moment. The name hovered in the air. It did not immediately mean anything to him, but something about the way Daniel said it made him glance down at the evidence pouch sitting on the desk. Inside it, a watch had slipped partly out from beneath the wallet. Ryan reached in and pulled it out. The metal was heavy, cold. A Patek Philippe Nautilus, platinum. Ryan had never owned a watch that expensive. He had seen pictures of them once in a magazine. Cost more than a house in some states. His eyes moved slowly from the watch to Daniel's face. Daniel was watching him now. Calm. Waiting. Ryan set the watch down carefully and turned back toward the computer. He opened a browser window, typed 2 words. Daniel Brooks. The search results loaded instantly. Forbes, Bloomberg, Financial Times. Photographs filled the screen. Daniel Brooks, standing beside world leaders. Daniel Brooks, speaking at economic forums. Daniel Brooks, Chief Executive Officer, Titan Ridge Capital. Estimated net worth, $9.5 billion. Ryan stared at the screen. Then he looked back at the man sitting on the metal bench, the torn hoodie, the dried blood at the corner of his mouth, the zip tie digging into his wrists. Ryan swallowed. The room suddenly felt smaller. He stood quickly and walked to the cell door. The keys rattled in his hand. The words stalled in his throat. He opened the door and stepped behind Daniel. A pair of cutters snapped through the plastic tie. Daniel brought his hands forward slowly. Blood rushed back into his fingers in a sharp, burning wave. Ryan cleared his throat. Sir, I didn't know. Daniel rubbed his wrists. The skin was raw. My phone. Ryan grabbed the evidence pouch and handed it over immediately. Daniel unlocked the screen. 14 missed messages, 3 missed calls. He ignored all of them. Instead, he opened his contacts. His thumb moved directly to one name, Victor Pierce, General Counsel. Ryan watched him dial. The phone rang once. Victor answered immediately. Daniel. Daniel leaned back against the wall. His voice was steady now. Victor, he said quietly, I need you to listen very carefully. He paused. Ryan could hear his own heartbeat now. I'm sitting in a holding room at JFK. Daniel's eyes lifted slowly toward Ryan. And we're about to destroy an airline. Victor Pierce did not speak for a full 2 seconds. The line was silent, except for the faint hum of city traffic bleeding through Victor's office window somewhere in Manhattan. Then his voice came through the phone, low and sharp. Daniel, tell me exactly what happened. Daniel leaned back against the cinder block wall. The cold surface pressed against his spine. His ribs flared again, with a quiet stab of pain, but he ignored it. I was removed from Apex Air Flight 492. Victor inhaled slowly on the other end. Removed how? Daniel glanced briefly at Sergeant Ryan Cole standing near the desk. The man looked like he wanted to disappear into the walls. With force. Victor's voice hardened. Were you arrested? No. Charged? No. Daniel wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. They broke a rib. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer confusion. It was calculation. Victor Pierce was 47 years old and had spent 2 decades dismantling corporations in courtrooms and negotiation rooms across 3 continents. His brain worked like a machine that never stopped turning. When he spoke again, the tone had shifted. Names. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, replaying the last 20 minutes. Flight attendant Emily Carter. A pause. Captain Michael Turner. Another pause. 3 airport security contractors. Victor's keyboard began clicking rapidly on the other end of the line. And the airline. Daniel looked up toward the ceiling lights. Apex Air. Victor let out a long, slow breath. Jesus. Daniel said nothing. Victor continued typing. You're sure about the rib? I heard it crack. Medical attention? Not yet. Victor's voice lowered again. Daniel, do you want me to call the police commissioner? No. The word came instantly. Ryan Cole looked up sharply from across the room. Victor hesitated. Then what do you want? Daniel opened his eyes. The pain in his chest had settled into a steady pulse now. Every breath reminded him of the knee that had driven into his ribs inside the aircraft. He thought about Emily Carter's face, the moment she decided he didn't belong in that seat. He thought about Captain Turner ripping the headphones from his head. He thought about Kyle Stanton laughing while security dragged him down the aisle. Then Daniel spoke. I want to end them. Victor was quiet again. The lawyer knew Daniel Brooks well enough to understand the difference between anger and intention. This was intention. You're talking about a lawsuit, Victor said carefully. No. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Too slow. Victor leaned back in his chair, somewhere miles away, staring at the skyline outside his office. You're thinking bigger. Daniel nodded slowly, even though Victor could not see it. Yes. Victor already knew where the conversation was going. Still, he asked. Explain. Daniel shifted slightly against the wall. Ryan Cole could hear every word now. Apex Air is leveraged. Victor nodded slowly to himself. Yes. 40 billion in debt. Yes. Daniel continued. They're holding together because their bond rating is barely above junk. Victor's fingers hovered over the keyboard. BBB-. Daniel opened his eyes. And who owns the largest block of their convertible bonds? Victor did not answer immediately, because he already knew the answer. Titan Ridge Capital. Daniel Brooks. Victor exhaled. You want to call the debt? Daniel's voice remained quiet. I want them to feel it. Victor turned back to his monitor. Stock tickers were already open across several screens. Apex Air Airlines. Symbol AXA. Friday closing price, $42.50. Market cap, $52 billion. Victor spoke again. You understand what happens if we move that position tonight? Daniel nodded again. Yes. You'll trigger margin clauses. Yes. You'll collapse their credit. Yes. Victor rubbed his temple slowly. And the stock will fall off a cliff. Daniel's eyes moved to the small window in the holding room. Outside, rain streaked across the glass. That's the idea. Ryan Cole shifted uncomfortably by the desk. He did not understand half the financial language being spoken, but he understood tone, and the tone sounded like something very large about to break. Victor's voice dropped even lower. You're talking about financial warfare, Daniel replied without hesitation. They started it. Victor sat silent for a moment. He had seen Daniel destroy companies before, quietly, legally, efficiently. But never like this, never with this level of personal motive. Once we start, Victor said carefully, there's no pulling it back. Daniel looked down at his bruised wrists. Good. Victor turned back toward his screens. His fingers began moving again. Step 1. He spoke as he typed. I dump our entire stock position in after hours trading. Daniel said nothing. Victor continued. That alone will scare the hedge funds. He clicked another window. Step 2. We call the credit facility. Ryan Cole's stomach tightened. The room felt smaller with every word. Victor spoke again. Step 3. Leak solvency concerns. Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. To who? Victor allowed himself the faintest smile. The Financial Times. Daniel nodded. Perfect. Victor leaned closer to the phone. Daniel, if we do this tonight, the domino effect will start before that plane even lands in London. Daniel glanced at the wall clock above the door. The second hand ticked steadily. Flight time to London. 6 hours. Plenty of time. Do it. Victor paused one final time. You're absolutely sure? Daniel's answer came cold and certain. Burn it down. Victor Pierce had built his reputation on making decisions other lawyers were too afraid to make. He pressed the first key. Trade order window opened. Sell position. Titan Ridge, Capital Holdings. Execute. Order placed. Daniel closed his eyes again. In the quiet holding room at JFK Airport, a man with a broken rib leaned against a concrete wall while billions of dollars began moving through invisible cables beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Victor spoke again. And Daniel. Yes, I'm sending a car and a doctor. Daniel's voice softened slightly. Thank you. Victor ended the call. Ryan Cole stared at the phone, still in Daniel's hand. He felt the strange sensoire sensation of standing beside a detonator someone had already triggered. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. Outside the small window, rain continued sliding down the glass. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Apex Air Flight 492 was climbing through dark clouds toward its cruising altitude. Inside the cockpit, Captain Michael Turner sipped coffee and relaxed into his seat. In first class, Emily Carter was serving warm nuts to Kyle Stanton in Seat 1A. Kyle lifted his glass again and grinned toward his phone. Best flight ever. None of them knew. Not yet. But somewhere in the digital bloodstream of the global financial system, Apex Air Airlines had just begun to bleed. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Apex Air, Flight 492, had settled into the quiet rhythm of a long international flight. The engines droned like distant thunder outside the fuselage. Inside the cabin, the lights had dimmed to a soft blue glow meant to calm tired passengers. Blankets rustled. Champagne glasses clinked softly. To anyone looking around, it was a normal flight. Calm, comfortable, routine. Emily Carter walked slowly down the first-class aisle, carrying a silver tray of warm nuts. Her posture had relaxed now that the confrontation was over. The tension from earlier had drained out of her shoulders, replaced by the professional efficiency she had practiced for years. The cabin smelled faintly of roasted almonds and citrus cleaning wipes. Kyle Stanton sat in seat 1A, leaning back with one leg crossed over the other. His phone was still in his hand. The small camera lens pointed lazily toward the aisle while he spoke to his followers. "Guys, you should have seen it earlier," he said, his voice low but excited. This dude literally refused to move. Total meltdown. His girlfriend beside him giggled without looking up from her screen. Emily stopped beside them and placed the tray on the armrest. "Mr. Stanton," she said warmly, the sweetness in her voice noticeably different from the tone she had used with Daniel earlier. "Would you like anything else to drink?" Kyle flashed a confident smile. "Champagne." "The good one?" Emily nodded immediately. "Of course." She lifted his empty glass and turned toward the galley. Across the aisle, Arthur Caldwell watched the interaction quietly over the top of his reading glasses. The elderly attorney had not returned to his newspaper since the incident. The words printed on the page meant nothing compared to the uneasy feeling still lingering in his chest. He had seen powerful men lose everything in courtrooms over smaller mistakes. Emily caught his gaze briefly as she passed. Arthur spoke before she could move away. "That man you removed," he said gently. "He wasn't violent." Emily's smile tightened. "Sir, the situation has been handled." Arthur leaned slightly forward. "I'm simply saying it escalated quickly." Emily's expression cooled. He refused crew instructions. Arthur watched her for another moment before nodding slowly. "I hope for your sake you're right." Emily walked away without replying. Up front, the cockpit door remained closed. Captain Michael Turner leaned back in his seat, hands resting loosely on the controls while the autopilot carried the aircraft through the dark sky. The cockpit lighting glowed faintly across the instrument panels. The first officer beside him checked a navigation screen. Turner took a sip of coffee and stretched his shoulders. "Good climb tonight," he said. The first officer nodded. "Smooth air ahead, too." Turner allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The earlier disruption was already fading from his mind. In 30 years of flying, he had removed dozens of passengers from flights. It was unpleasant, but sometimes necessary. Airline rules were clear. Once the captain made a decision, the matter was finished. He glanced at the flight clock. 2 hours to the midpoint over the Atlantic. 6 hours to London. Plenty of time to relax. Back in the first-class cabin, Emily returned with Kyle's champagne. She placed the glass carefully on his tray table. "Here you go." Kyle lifted it immediately. "To VIP treatment," he said with a grin. His girlfriend laughed again. Emily smiled politely. Enjoy the flight. But something else was already happening far below the aircraft, invisible to everyone on board. In a glass office tower in Manhattan, Victor Pierce stared at a wall of monitors, glowing red and white in the darkness. He had loosened his tie and rolled his sleeves halfway up his forearms. Across the screens, financial charts were beginning to move. The first order had already executed. Titan Ridge Capital had just sold one of the largest blocks of Apex Air stock ever traded in after hours markets. Victor watched the price shift. $42, $41.70, $41.20. The drop was small at first. Then the algorithms noticed. Computer systems designed to protect hedge funds from sudden risk began reacting automatically. Sell orders started stacking on top of each other in rapid bursts. Victor spoke quietly into the headset resting around his neck. Phase 2. A trader in Singapore answered through a crackling connection. You want confirmation on the bond liquidation? Yes. That volume will trigger rating alerts. Victor didn't hesitate. Do it. A few seconds later, the red line on the chart dipped harder. $39. 37. 34. Victor leaned back slowly in his chair. Good. He opened another encrypted message window. The email recipient field blinked. Financial Times Investigative Desk. Subject line. Rumor of Apex Air liquidity crisis. He attached documents, loan agreements, convertible bond holdings. Then he hit send. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the news traveled faster than any airplane. Inside the quiet first-class cabin of Flight 492, Arthur Caldwell was the only passenger still awake. He glanced toward seat 1A again. Kyle Stanton was now watching his own live stream replay, laughing softly as comments scrolled across the screen. Arthur studied the young man for a moment. Then he looked toward the empty aisle where Daniel Brooks had been dragged away. The old lawyer felt a strange uneasiness settle deeper into his chest. Something about the way that man had spoken earlier. Not angry. Not frightened. Certain. Arthur leaned back in his seat slowly. He had once represented a Wall Street executive who spoke exactly that way before dismantling an entire competitor in federal court. The memory made him uneasy. High above the ocean, the airplane continued gliding through dark clouds. Captain Turner checked the instruments again and took another sip of coffee. Behind him, Emily Carter dimmed the lights further in the cabin and prepared the overnight service. Everything felt calm, controlled, routine. But thousands of miles away, in electronic markets that never truly slept, Apex Air Airlines was already falling. $32, 28, 25. Victor Pierce watched the numbers slide downward like stones dropped into deep water. He whispered to himself quietly, "That's for the rib." And somewhere above the Atlantic, completely unaware of the storm forming beneath them, Apex Air Flight 492 continued racing toward London. The video appeared online 40 minutes after the plane left the ground. It started quietly. A shaky clip filmed from seat 4C. The camera pointed down the aisle, slightly tilted, capturing the moment when the first security officer grabbed Daniel Brooks by the hoodie. The audio was messy. Passengers whispering, someone gasping. The sudden thud of bodies shifting in the narrow aisle. Then the sound, the crack of bone. The moment Daniel's body went limp as they dragged him down the aisle like luggage. The clip ended with his sneaker rolling across the carpet, while someone off camera whispered, "Oh my God." The person who posted it was a 19-year-old college student named Megan Parker. She uploaded it to TikTok with a caption typed in shaking hands. "Apex Air just beat up a passenger for no reason. I'm literally shaking." At first, the video gathered a few hundred views. Then the algorithm noticed. By 9:15 in the evening, a travel blogger on Twitter reposted the clip. The caption was simple. "This is disturbing. Apex Air explained this." 10 minutes later, the video appeared on Reddit. The thread exploded. People paused the clip frame by frame. They zoomed in on faces, on uniforms, on the moment Captain Turner pointed toward Daniel and said, "That one." By 9:45, the internet had turned into a swarm. A financial analyst on Twitter, with nearly 400,000 followers, posted a screenshot of Daniel's face from the video. The tweet read, "Everyone thinks this is just some random guy. Look again. That's Daniel Brooks, Chief Executive Officer of Titan Ridge Capital, net worth $9.5 billion, and Apex Air just had him beaten and dragged off their plane." Within minutes, the tweet had been shared thousands of times. By 10 in the evening, the hashtags began spreading. Justice for Daniel. Boycott Apex Air. Arrest the crew. On television screens across the country, the footage began replaying on a loop. Cable news anchors leaned forward with serious expressions while the video rolled behind them. The sound of the crack echoed again and again. In Dallas, Texas, the executive floor of Apex Air headquarters lit up like a hospital emergency room. Phones began ringing everywhere. Assistants ran down hallways carrying tablets and laptops. In the center conference room sat Robert Caldwell, 54 years old, Chief Executive Officer of Apex Air Airlines. He had been asleep 30 minutes earlier. Now he stood at the head of the table in a wrinkled dress shirt, staring at the television mounted on the wall. The video ended. It restarted again. And again. Caldwell ran his hand across his forehead. "Tell me that's not what it looks like." No one spoke for a moment. Finally, the head of public relations, Elena Martinez, cleared her throat. "It's already at 8 million views." Caldwell looked at her. "How?" "Social media." Caldwell turned toward the CFO sitting beside her. David Chen had his laptop open in front of him. His face looked pale under the fluorescent lights. "It gets worse," Chen said quietly. Caldwell frowned. "What do you mean, worse?" Chen rotated the laptop screen toward him. A stock chart filled the display. The red line plunged downward like a falling elevator. Apex Air stock dropped 20% in after-hours trading. Caldwell blinked. "That's impossible." Chen shook his head slowly. "It's happening." The number in the corner of the screen continued changing. $30, 28, 26. Who's selling? Chen hesitated. Then he answered, "Titan Ridge Capital." The room went silent. Caldwell felt something cold settle into his stomach. "Wait," he said slowly. "Titan Ridge?" Chen nodded. "Yes." Caldwell looked back toward the television screen where the video replayed again. Daniel Brooks being dragged across the cabin floor. The realization hit him like a hammer. Jesus Christ. Elena Martinez spoke carefully. That's the man in the video. Caldwell turned slowly. You're telling me the passenger we just assaulted is Daniel Brooks? No one needed to finish the sentence. Chen continued quietly. He owns the largest block of our convertible bonds. Caldwell stared at him. How large? $4.5 billion. Caldwell grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. The room suddenly felt too warm. And he's selling our stock. Chen nodded. Yes. Caldwell swallowed. What happens if he calls the debt? Chen didn't answer right away, because everyone in the room already knew. Finally, he said the words anyway. We default. The room erupted into overlapping voices. That can't happen. We have credit lines. We can negotiate. Caldwell slammed his hand down on the table. Quiet. The room fell silent again. He turned slowly toward Elena. Get his phone number. Elena nodded quickly and began typing. Across the table, Chen stared at the stock chart again. $22. 19. Caldwell's phone vibrated in his hand. Elena slid a piece of paper across the table. Personal contact. Daniel Brooks. Caldwell hesitated. Then he pressed the call button. Across the country, in a black Maybach sedan, leaving JFK Airport, Daniel Brooks watched the rain slide across the window glass. His rib throbbed with every bump in the road. A bag of ice rested against his side. His phone vibrated. Unknown caller. Daniel answered calmly. Yes. Caldwell's voice came through tight with panic. Daniel, this is Robert Caldwell, CEO of Apex Air. Daniel stared out the window at the dark highway lights. I know who you are. Caldwell exhaled shakily. Daniel, we have a situation. Daniel said nothing. Caldwell continued. What happened tonight was a misunderstanding. Daniel's eyes closed briefly. A misunderstanding. The knee slamming into his ribs. The crack, the blood. He spoke quietly. Is that what you're calling it? Caldwell rushed on. We are terminating the employees involved. Daniel said nothing. We will issue a full apology. Silence. We will compensate you. Still silence. Caldwell's voice rose slightly. Daniel, please stop the sell order. The car rolled through the rain. Streetlights slid across Daniel's face like passing searchlights. Finally he spoke. You know what your captain said to me? Caldwell hesitated. No. Daniel opened his eyes. He said he didn't take orders from hoodlums in sweatpants. Caldwell's breath caught. Daniel's voice remained calm. I gave him a chance to walk away. The car turned onto the highway ramp. Rain hammered against the windshield. Daniel continued. He laughed. Caldwell whispered, I'm sorry. Daniel shook his head slowly. You should be. Then he ended the call. And far away on the trading screens, still glowing red in Victor Pierce's office, Apex Air Airlines dropped below $15 per share. The rain over New York had turned heavier by the time Daniel Brooks arrived at the hotel. The black Maybach rolled quietly beneath the covered entrance, while the doorman hurried forward with an umbrella. The lobby lights glowed warm against the dark street outside. Inside, marble floors reflected the soft yellow glow of chandeliers, the kind of place where power moved quietly through polished hallways and hushed conversations. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly. The pain in his ribs sharpened when he straightened. He didn't react. Years in boardrooms had taught him something simple about pain. You acknowledge it. Then you move anyway. Victor Pierce was already waiting in the private lounge upstairs. The lawyer stood near the window overlooking Midtown, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting off the glass behind him. Daniel entered without speaking. Victor turned. For a moment, the lawyer said nothing as he took in the sight of him. The torn hoodie, the bruise beginning to darken along the side of his jaw. The way Daniel's breathing came just slightly slower than normal. Victor's voice was quiet. They actually broke it. Daniel lowered himself into the leather chair near the table. Probably cracked. Victor nodded. A doctor had already been called. Ice packs and painkillers sat untouched beside Daniel on the glass table. But Daniel wasn't paying attention to any of it. His eyes were fixed on the screens. Red numbers everywhere. Victor tapped a key. The largest monitor expanded the chart. Apex Air Airlines. Stock price, $12.80. Daniel watched the line continue falling. Victor spoke calmly. The first wave hit the hedge funds. Another chart appeared. Then the algorithms. The red line dipped again. $11. Victor leaned against the desk. Once those systems detect institutional selling at this scale, they start dumping automatically. Daniel nodded slowly. That's the domino effect. Victor opened another window. Global bond markets. Apex Air convertible bonds were collapsing. Credit spreads widening. Rating agencies are already flagging them. Daniel rested the ice pack against his ribs. The cold cut through the pain like clean water through smoke. Victor continued. We triggered the margin clauses an hour ago. Daniel looked up. And the banks. Victor exhaled. They're pulling back. Across the world, the financial system had begun reacting like a living organism sensing injury. In London, hedge fund traders starting their morning were already staring at the same charts Victor had open in Manhattan. In Tokyo, algorithmic trading programs had begun selling Apex Air shares in automated bursts. The red line dropped again. $10. Victor leaned forward slightly. The rumor hit Bloomberg. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Already? Victor nodded. Solvency concerns. He turned another monitor toward Daniel. A private financial chat room filled the screen, messages flashing rapidly. Titan Ridge is liquidating Apex Air. Debt exposure. Possible default. Sell now. Daniel watched silently. Then he spoke. How long until the credit lines freeze? Victor glanced at the clock. Hours. The room grew quiet again. Outside the window, the city moved normally. Taxis, traffic, people walking home. No one on those sidewalks had any idea an airline was dying in the background. Daniel leaned back. He closed his eyes for a moment. Not from exhaustion, from memory. The moment inside the plane when Emily Carter looked at him and decided what kind of man he must be. The way Captain Turner ripped the headphones from his head like a schoolyard bully. the laughter from Kyle Stanton's seat. Daniel opened his eyes again. The chart dropped further. $9. Victor spoke softly. We could stop now. Daniel looked at him. Victor continued. You've already hurt them. Daniel said nothing. Victor shrugged slightly. A settlement would still be massive. Daniel turned his gaze back toward the falling chart. This isn't about money. Victor studied him. No. Daniel's voice remained calm. This is about culture. Victor leaned back against the desk. He understood exactly what Daniel meant. A company culture that allowed a flight attendant to look at a passenger and decide he didn't belong. A captain who believed authority meant humiliation. Daniel watched the numbers flicker again. $8. Victor's phone vibrated on the desk. He glanced down. Then he smiled slightly. The Financial Times. He answered the call quickly. Yes. The reporter's voice crackled faintly through the speaker. Victor listened for a few seconds. Yes, he said calmly. The documents are authentic. Another pause. No comment beyond that. Victor ended the call. He turned back to Daniel. That article goes live in 10 minutes. Daniel nodded. Across the Atlantic Ocean, Apex Air Flight 492 continued gliding through darkness. Inside the cockpit, Captain Michael Turner stretched his arms and glanced at the fuel gauges. Smooth flight, clear skies ahead. Behind him, Emily Carter moved quietly through the cabin, collecting empty glasses. The passengers were sleeping now. Kyle Stanton had finally set his phone down and leaned back beneath a blanket. Arthur Caldwell remained awake. The old attorney stared through the oval window at the black Atlantic far below. Something about the night felt wrong. He couldn't explain it. The quiet felt too complete, too calm. Back in Manhattan, Victor refreshed the screen again. $7. The Financial Times headline appeared seconds later. Exclusive. Titan Ridge Capital liquidates Apex Air Holdings following incident involving CEO Daniel Brooks. Victor turned the monitor toward Daniel. The photo in the article showed a freeze frame from the viral video. Daniel being dragged down the aisle, his shoe half off. Passengers staring. Daniel studied the image without expression. The next line in the article appeared beneath it. Apex Air faces liquidity crisis after altercation with major creditor. Victor whispered softly. That's the kill shot. The stock chart plunged again. $5. Daniel slowly stood. The movement made his ribs scream. He ignored it. Victor watched him. You okay? Daniel nodded once. He walked slowly toward the window. Far below, Manhattan lights glittered like constellations. Daniel spoke quietly. When that plane lands in London, Victor finished the thought. The world will already know. Daniel nodded. The stock dropped again. $4. And 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, completely unaware of the storm waiting for them on the ground, Apex Air Flight 492 continued its long flight toward London. Dawn was just beginning to break over London when Apex Air Flight 492 started its descent toward Heathrow. The sky outside the cockpit window glowed with a thin line of pale orange along the horizon. Below the clouds, the city stretched beyond and quiet, morning traffic just beginning to stir along distant highway. Captain Michael Turner adjusted his headset and glanced at the instrument panel. "Beginning descent," he said calmly. The first officer nodded. "Wind looks light." Turner leaned back slightly, satisfied. It had been an uneventful flight, no turbulence, no mechanical issues, no more disruptions after the passenger removal at JFK, just another overnight crossing. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin lights slowly brightened. Emily Carter moved through the aisle, waking the first-class passengers with practiced softness. "Good morning," she said gently to each seat. "We'll be landing shortly." Her voice had returned to the smooth, professional tone she used every day. The incident from hours earlier had already faded in her mind into something smaller. Handled. Resolved. Kyle Stanton stretched in seat 1A and rubbed his eyes. "Already?" he muttered. Emily smiled. "We made good time." Kyle reached for his phone. The airplane Wi-Fi had been off for most of the flight. Now it flickered back to life as the aircraft dropped closer to Europe. His screen lit up instantly. Notifications began exploding across it. Hundreds, then thousands. Kyle frowned. "What the?" His girlfriend leaned closer. "What happened?" Kyle opened Instagram. The comment counter spun wildly. His latest story, the selfie he had posted hours earlier sipping champagne in seat 1A. The caption, "First class all to myself." The comment section looked like a battlefield. "Traitor. Seat thief. You ruined a man's life. Delete this." Kyle blinked. What are they talking about? Emily had moved 2 rows down, waking another passenger. Arthur Caldwell remained seated quietly, fastening his seatbelt. He noticed Kyle's sudden confusion. "What is it?" Kyle scrolled faster. More notifications. Twitter mentions, news alerts. His expression shifted slowly from confusion to unease. Why is everyone talking about that guy from earlier? Arthur leaned forward slightly. "What guy?" Kyle looked up. The dude they dragged off. Arthur felt the uneasiness in his chest return. He glanced toward Emily. Then he said quietly, "You should probably look at the news." Kyle opened a browser. The page loaded slowly through the aircraft connection. Then the headline appeared. "Apex Air, Airline under fire after violent removal of billionaire investor Daniel Brooks." Kyle stared at the screen. "Billionaire." Arthur's voice remained calm. "Yes." Kyle scrolled down. The video filled the page. The same clip. Security grabbing Daniel. The crack of bone. Passengers gasping. Kyle's face appeared briefly in the background, laughing. His stomach dropped. What the hell? The aircraft touched down seconds later. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thud. Inside the cockpit, Captain Turner smiled. "Nice landing." The first officer nodded. "Smooth." Turner guided the aircraft toward the gate. Everything still felt normal, routine, professional. But the moment the airplane stopped at Gate 22, something strange appeared through the cockpit window. Flashes, bright white bursts of light. Turner frowned. "What's that?" The first officer leaned forward. "Cameras?" Turner unbuckled his seatbelt. "That can't be right." Behind them, Emily Carter stood at the forward door, preparing to open it. She smoothed her uniform jacket and placed her hand on the handle. Another flash exploded through the small window. Emily blinked. That's odd. She opened the door. The jet bridge erupted in light. Flash, flash, flash. Cameras everywhere. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder. Microphones pushed forward like weapons. Emily stumbled back one step. What is this? The questions came instantly. Emily Carter. Did you racially profile Daniel Brooks? Did you know he suffered a fractured rib? How does it feel to bankrupt your airline? Emily froze. Her brain struggled to process the words. Bankrupt. The word didn't make sense. Behind her, Captain Turner stepped out of the cockpit. What's going on here? The reporters pivoted toward him. Shutters exploded again. Captain Turner, are you aware Apex Air stock has collapsed 90% overnight? Did you know Daniel Brooks owns the airline's debt? Turner stared at them. What? A reporter stepped closer. Your airline is insolvent, Captain. The CEO has called emergency meetings all night. Turner's face drained of color. That's impossible. The crowd shifted as two uniformed officers from the London Metropolitan Police pushed forward. Captain Michael Turner, one officer said firmly. Turner swallowed. Yes. You and Emily Carter are being detained for questioning regarding an assault incident reported at JFK Airport. Emily's legs nearly gave out. I didn't assault anyone. The officer's voice remained steady. There's video. Behind them, passengers began stepping off the aircraft. Kyle Stanton tried to slip past quietly with his hood pulled low. A photographer spotted him instantly. That's him! More cameras turned. Seat 1A. Kyle froze. Flashes exploded around him. Why did you take Daniel Brooks's seat? Kyle pushed through the crowd. I didn't know. His voice cracked. I didn't know. But the cameras followed him down the jet bridge. Inside the doorway, Emily Carter stood frozen. Her carefully practiced smile had vanished. Tears streaked through her makeup. Captain Turner looked older suddenly, smaller. The authority he carried for 30 years had evaporated under the weight of reality. He looked toward the officers. I was following protocol. One officer nodded. You can explain that downtown. Turner lowered his head. Behind the chaos, the passengers from Flight 492 slowly walked past the wall of reporters. Arthur Caldwell paused near the door. He looked back at Emily and Turner one last time. Then he stepped into the terminal. Far away in Manhattan, Daniel Brooks stood by the window of his hotel suite. Victor Pierce sat behind him watching another screen. Apex Air Airlines. Stock price. $2.12. Daniel's phone vibrated. Victor glanced at the incoming alert. Flight 492 just landed. Daniel didn't turn around. Outside the window, the city had fully awakened. Traffic filled. The streets below. The world kept moving. Daniel spoke quietly. They know now. Victor nodded. Yes. And somewhere inside Heathrow Airport, surrounded by cameras and police officers, Emily Carter finally realized that the man she had dragged out of seat 1A had just destroyed her entire world. 1 year later, The Skyline Grand Hotel overlooked Central Park like a quiet monument to power. Snow drifted lightly across the early evening air outside the tall glass windows. Inside the penthouse suite, the lighting was warm and soft, reflecting off polished wood and marble floors. Cameras had been arranged thoughtfully across the room. Microphones rested on low tables. Producers moved quietly along the walls, making final adjustments. Daniel Brooks sat calmly in a deep leather chair. This time, he wore a navy suit perfectly tailored to his frame. The hoodie was gone. The bruises had healed months ago. Only a faint stiffness in his ribs remained when the weather turned cold. Across from him sat Barbara Walters. The legendary interviewer leaned slightly forward with a small notebook resting in her lap. Her expression carried the same focused calm that had confronted presidents, movie stars, and horse corporate titans for decades. The cameras began recording. Barbara studied Daniel carefully before speaking. It has been 1 year since the incident on Apex Air Flight 492. Daniel nodded once. Outside the window, the city lights flickered alive across Manhattan. Barbara continued. That airline no longer exists. Her voice remained steady. Apex Air declared bankruptcy within 3 weeks of that night. The company was liquidated. 40,000 employees lost their jobs. She paused for a moment. The brand disappeared. Daniel remained silent. Barbara tilted her head slightly. Do you feel responsible? Daniel looked at her. His expression was calm, measured, almost detached. Responsible implies that I caused the original event. Barbara watched him closely. You triggered the financial collapse. Daniel nodded. Yes. Barbara waited. But I didn't create the conditions that allowed it. The room remained very quiet. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together. The collapse started long before that flight ever left the ground. Barbara raised an eyebrow. Explain. Daniel's voice remained calm. When a company builds a culture where employees feel comfortable humiliating customers based on how they look, the collapse is already in progress. Barbara glanced down briefly at her notes. Emily Carter. Daniel said nothing. Former flight attendant. Terminated. She turned another page. Captain Michael Turner. Lost his pension in the bankruptcy. Daniel's eyes did not move. Barbara continued. He now works driving a shuttle bus for a rental car company in Tampa. The cameras remained fixed on Daniel's face. No reaction. Barbara spoke again. Kyle Stanton. Daniel finally blinked. The influencer. Barbara nodded. He lost every sponsorship within 48 hours. She paused again. His media career never recovered. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. Barbara looked up from her notes. The public reaction was intense. Daniel nodded. People saw themselves in that moment. Barbara tilted her head. In you. Daniel shook his head slowly. No. In the idea that anyone could be judged incorrectly. He gestured slightly with one hand. A hoodie. Sneakers. Silence. Barbara listened carefully. The assumptions people make. Daniel continued. Everyone thinks power looks a certain way. Barbara smiled faintly. And you didn't. Daniel allowed a small smile of his own. That was the point. Barbara closed the notebook in her lap. Titan Ridge. Capital eventually acquired 20 of Apex Air's aircraft during the liquidation auction. Daniel nodded again. At a discount. Barbara leaned forward slightly. And those planes are now part of a new charter airline. Daniel's smile returned. Yes? Barbara raised an eyebrow. The name is interesting. Daniel's voice was soft. Calmer air. Barbara glanced briefly toward the camera. Some people have called what happened revenge. Daniel shook his head slowly. Revenge is emotional. Barbara waited. This was structural. The words hung in the room like quiet thunder. Daniel continued. If I had simply accepted a settlement, nothing would have changed. Barbara nodded slowly. You wanted a precedent. Daniel looked out the window for a moment. The snow outside had begun falling harder now. Yes, Barbara asked quietly. What precedent? Daniel turned back toward her. That respect matters. The room remained silent. Daniel spoke again. In business, in service, in life. Barbara studied him carefully. You destroyed a $52 billion company to prove that. Daniel did not hesitate. No. He leaned forward slightly. The company destroyed itself. Barbara considered that. Then she nodded. The cameras continued rolling. Outside, the city lights reflected off the falling snow. Daniel Brooks sat quietly in the chair. The man once dragged across the floor of an airplane cabin, now calmly discussing the downfall of an entire airline. The story had traveled across the world. A simple moment of judgment. A single seat in first class. Seat 1A. Barbara looked toward the camera. That is the story of how one decision on a flight changed the fate of a global airline. Daniel remained still beside her. The producers slowly lowered their equipment. The interview ended, but the lesson remained. People often believe they know who someone is the moment they see them. A hoodie, a tired face, a quiet passenger sitting alone. And sometimes they are terribly wrong. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with 3 simple words. Respect matters always.